Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we're discussing sovereign space. What's driving nations toward building and acquiring national space assets? Which factors could hinder efforts towards sovereignty? And how nations are balancing sovereignty with strategic collaboration in space. Joining us is Alessio Bonucci, Associate Director for the Aerospace and Defense Practice of Boston Consulting Group. He's here to unpack the pressures reshaping space sovereignty, from industrial bottlenecks to shifting alliances, and how they will determine how nations navigate sovereignty in space over the coming years. Alessio, a big topic. You ready to jump in? Are you ready?
We're ready, John. Good morning, everyone. A pleasure to be here.
Good. So, Alessio, what does sovereignty in space actually hinge on right now in ways you think most people overlook?
I think it's really the complexity of sovereignty across the value chain, which encompasses all the different steps, especially in space, of course, from launch to manufacturing to managing the satellites to servicing to actually customers. But even more, for each of these elements, then you have nuances in terms of how do you get to that level of sovereignty, And I'm thinking about, for example, critical materials. I'm thinking about sovereignty on where you launch from. If we take the example of Europe, in this moment, majority of launches are performed out of French Guiana and Kourou, which has performed extremely well in the last few years, but at the same time, it's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So not exactly the closest place that you would consider fully sovereign in case of an escalation or else.
Yeah. Well, recording this, and I'm in Washington, D.C., you're over in Italy there. And so when you look at Europe's space ambitions today, what feels like the real bottleneck shaping what's possible?
Well, that's definitely a combination of budget, which in the past few years used to be a constraint, especially in Europe. Nowadays, not very much so. And now what's really driving capabilities at the end of the day? How much can you deliver? How fast? And how innovative, I would also say. So how can you really be competitive from a 360 perspective, which is really what SpaceX has brought to the industry. It's the new set of, again, skills in terms of vertical integration. Again, also within the single value chain. They own very much of what they do in terms of launch capabilities. They do not outsource even simple components as much as they can.
Yeah.
Doing this in an industrial landscape that, at least in Europe, was not very much aligned in the same way, presents some challenges in terms of adaptation from an industrial perspective.
In my introduction, I talked about balance. I think this is going to be the theme of this whole interview here. So where do you see the most tension emerging between Europe's desire for greater control in space and its reliance on global industrial partners? There's a push and pull there, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is not only true for space industry, but for the overall defense industry at the moment, and potentially even beyond. If we think about global supply chains now being struck by the crisis in Iran and the lack of basically oil products out here in Europe, we don't even know if we're going to be able to fly out in the upcoming summer. And this is even more true if you think about an industry that historically has been intrinsically global, with supply chains really stretching across oceans. In terms of critical components, as I mentioned earlier, but even specific solutions. This presents some challenges at the end of the day. How do you balance this? And I think on one end, what we're seeing is a significant push towards higher level of independency, because the current geopolitical tensions are bringing also some opportunities rather than some complications, but also keeping, I would say, a balanced way between how we mean sovereignty at European level and a national level. This is another critical element that is sometimes overlooked. Many countries are pushing in terms of new capabilities, in terms of constellations. How we're going to be able to integrate this in a federated way, if you want, is what's going to really make the difference between successful and competitive solutions versus just replication over replication.
We've been using the word sovereign here a whole lot. When I think of the word sovereign, I think some kind of control or something, So what part of the space ecosystem do you see becoming the biggest test of whether a nation actually has control over its capabilities?
I would have to say in the short term, it's definitely going to be launch capabilities. We're in a moment where, again, SpaceX performs 50% of global launches and puts on orbit 80% of global mass.
Yeah.
And if we think that Starship is somehow going to be successful, this is only going to get even more skewed. So if we really want to be there in terms of capabilities, launch is the next key thing. Because if you think about manufacturing or operations, at the end of the day, operations many countries can do, even if they cannot even manufacture a satellite. They typically buy from established players, Boeing, Lockheed, Thales Alenia Space, Airbus, you name it. The next level is, of course, manufacturing satellites themselves. These can have some shades in terms of capabilities, in terms of size, in terms of course, again, competitiveness. But where I really see a potential bottleneck coming our way is really launch capabilities. And this, again, encompasses the entire ecosystem. It's not only launchers, which are traditionally the most complicated element of the value chain. Usually people say this is not rocket science. That is the rocket science.
It is, yeah. We're living in a very, very competitive world. I mean, everyone in the world seems to be interested in the space sector. So how is Europe's position in the space sector evolving as more countries pursue their own sovereign infrastructure?
Well, it's certainly growing, and I would say it's definitely interesting to look from an external perspective because you see new players, new approaches, new countries that traditionally were basically considering space as an oasis, and so really a subtle element to be put into balance sheet at some point. All of a sudden, realize the sovereignty, not only from a space perspective, but across a number of commercial and governmental perspective. I think about communications, I think about Earth observation, will also rely on space capabilities, and the enablement the space industry has been able to unravel for many other industries is going to get bigger and bigger. Still example, Deliveroo, Just Eat, Global, you name it. All of these players are only able to be there because we can use GPS or Galileo or whatever constellation you think that is enabled by space capabilities that are free for everyone, basically. And now we give it for granted. But that was not the case 50 years ago because they were really not existing.
Yeah. Talk about big players and small players here. So what patterns do you see in how middle power countries are trying to build their own space sovereignty, without the scale of these big players, larger players?
And that's a kind of very interesting point. And I would split this in two between countries that are still within, I would say, a European or a Western umbrella, where of course they need to play, let's say, by NATO rules at large, which means anyhow they are within the European Space Agency or of course with a significant relationship with the US in terms of either traditional launch capabilities, reliance against satellite manufacturing and the rest. These countries at the end of the day are trying to sustain national champions, although small, although emerging, but to again grow as much as possible their level of independence, also to get sustainment in terms of GDP growth and etc. So it has some concrete socioeconomic benefit that I can immediately claim, and it also helps from a political perspective. If you then vice versa look at countries that are more, I would say, in between, if you think, for example, Middle East, Southeast Asia or else, now they're looking at this in a much more pragmatic and concrete way. It's not necessarily US or Europe reliance, but it's trade-offs between what can I get from the US or Europe, or what can I get from Russia, or what can I get from China, and what drives me in terms of overall nation to the best possible outcome. India is part of the Artemis Accord. At the same time, they're pursuing their own independent capabilities in space across the board. And I would say that's also an interesting reflection for many European countries now that there is potentially a growing, I will not call it decoupling, but less strong entanglement between the European and the American economies and capabilities to look at how they can be more of a equal partner to the US rather than a junior partner, because that really means that at the end of the day, if from one day to the other, you see decisions that are not very much aligned to what you were expecting, you don't have an umbrella. You really do not know how to solve this issue. Let's take the example of removing the 5,000 soldiers from Germany that President Trump has just announced. Whether that is going to happen or not, I think it does not matter. It matters that you do not have the same comfort from the overall defense perspective that Europe has experienced over the last 50 years and more. And therefore, we need to find a way to take matters into our own hands, what proper level of partnership. And as such, I think it can also be much more beneficial to the US themselves, rather than having the need to supply somebody that is not really capable of standing on its own. No? I think Europe is ready to do so. It has the capabilities from an industrial perspective. It also has to recognize that doing this requires some extra efforts, again, in terms of competitiveness, speed, innovation. balancing these two ecosystems will be quite interesting to see.
Well, there's the word for this interview, balancing. This is a theme here. So where do you see the tension between commercial growth and national sovereignty playing out most visibly in the next few years? Another balance, huh?
Indeed. And I think, though, that at least in this case, what we're seeing is that the sovereignty push is getting stronger and stronger, whether it's for SATCOM or for Earth observation opportunities. What's happening at the end of the day is that all major players are pausing or pushing aside the commercial opportunities because the governmental one, especially related to defense, are much more interesting from an overall set of perspective. They are typically larger size checks. They're typically longer term contracts, much more bundled opportunities rather than going after 25 different customers. You just need to go after one big MOD if you want to be very simplistic. And this, again, provides at the end of the day opportunities for players that are still wanting to balance, if you want, and to push after the commercial guys, because those needs are still going to be there. They have not disappeared in terms of, for example, agricultural companies, logistics, transportation, in-flight connectivity, you name it at the end of the day. It's really endless. And those can be actually served as customers as of now. And if you do not do it in the next 2 or 3 years, 5 years down the line, the big guys that at the end of the day got the large government contracts and probably manage leveraging those assets to also serve those other customers will have it all.
You talked about geopolitics earlier. So how are current geopolitical frictions changing the conversations you hear about long-term control of infrastructure in orbit?
Well, that's definitely another interesting point, and how we're going to see that challenging to envision at this stage, given the high level of complexity that basically brings to that, as well as the uncertainties of how do we treat those. At the end of the day, think about it. At the moment, there is no concrete agreement of how those assets needs to be managed. Because so far, space has been mostly, and I would say, hopefully it's going to be the case, but not necessarily peaceful. That peaceful cooperation that was really embodied by the International Space Station between US on one end and, of course, the Soviet Union and Russia on the other was the perfect representation of this peace in space, cooperation, let's get all together. At the same time, this basically brought a lack of jurisdiction and clarity on how do you treat some elements when these might not necessarily be the case. Let's be very concrete. Yeah. How do you protect commercial satellites if those commercial satellites are also used to provide solutions, however shape, in whatever shape, to other governments? Whose responsibility is that? Is it for the commercial company? Who should they hire to? They're not going to be able to hire an MOD. Should it be their customer? Yeah. Might not necessarily be the same country that hosts those satellites and that they belong to, because the company might not necessarily be from that country. This creates some complexity on how we're going to be able to actually manage it. And again, a situation where capabilities really drive the realm of opportunities. Are you going to be able to have satellites properly secure with the right level of resiliency, being able to monitor what others are doing nearby your satellites? All of these questions will need to be addressed in the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, we really risk investing billions in assets and potentially even more if we think about orbital data centers and further, without a clear risk management perspective. And if we think, for example, from a private equity venture capital perspective, this might get extremely tricky. How do you manage insurance on those assets?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, I'm in Washington, D.C., so I got to bring in a federal government perspective here. So what kinds of decisions do you think companies will need to make differently if NATO's space posture remains undefined for a while?
I would definitely say it's going to be about own investment. And some companies, both in the US and Europe, in the last few years have been heavily supported, given their role within the overall national aerospace and defense ecosystem, and to be the provider of choice for the specific governments. By doing so, they, of course, enable the right level of capabilities for those countries, but at the same time, never took the entrepreneurial mindset, if you want, of investing on its own capital before actually seeing a contract. And this again what SpaceX changed into the equation. Investing private capital into the development of Starlink was somehow a game changer for the industry. And it opened up new opportunities and new capabilities and again new services that were not there before, at least not at a proper level of competitiveness from a pricing perspective, for example. Because nowadays I can basically buy a Starlink contract solution at home that has performance and cost that are equivalent to fiber. Mm-hmm. And in some areas, this is much better. 10 years ago, it would have been impossible to do so. Now it is, and it's a real competitor for new domains. So it's really bringing new value pools to the industry. The companies rather, that will be able to bet on themselves, on constellations, on capabilities, on infrastructure, on assets, will be the one in a position to really determine how the market evolves, because they will unlock the customers at the end of the day and the value pools.
I asked you a question about NATO. Now I got a question about non-NATO, if that's an interesting term or not. As more non-NATO partners grow their space ambitions, what dynamics stand out to you and how they define sovereignty differently from Europe or even the United States?
We slightly touched this even earlier, no? And I will double down happily on that. I think the first key element is, as we said, not necessarily a binary position between Western world and non-Western world. No, it's not good and bad necessarily. It's trade-offs between what the different companies and the different countries are willing to put on the table, for example, on a G2G agreement. Because that's really what we're talking about. You know, it's not something that you buy or purchase independently without a strong support from the government on both sides. The second element is that anyhow, especially some of these new countries are bringing lots of capital to the table. And this is quite interesting because, again, you have the opportunity to support other players that might have those capabilities, but might not be on a strong capital position. And therefore, to make the investment that we're talking about, for example, on infrastructure, on constellation, let's take a Quatis partnership between Space 42 and Viasat. I think that's a key example of that. Can really build on those capabilities to unlock some next generation solutions. And again, now budget is not an issue anymore if we think about Europe. Maybe in the US it has never been, at least on a relative scale. But still, to do this with own capital and not necessarily on public contracts that still require long-term agreements and a slow-moving decision process can really be a differentiator for the industry.
So which technologies or operational practices do you see becoming the quiet determinants of who really has strategic freedom in space?
Well, we talked about the rockets. Those are not necessarily quiet.
Yeah.
But I would say, again, if you look into the subtle dimensions of the value chain, for example, terminals. Terminals are a key element. Even SpaceX struggled for a long time in terms of unit of economics because they were too expensive to manufacture and basically for anybody to afford on a typical contract. No? And then we scale, they solve the problem. But to really look at these specific elements, whether it's the ground stations, again, I think now we have the facts to support that France blocked the sale of the ground stations to EQT for a very simple reason that they consider that a strategic asset. And EQT is a private equity fund, European one, potentially another sovereign nation still an ally of France. They prefer to keep it in-house. As simple as that. And I think that's really the representation of even a specific step of the value chain that typically is very much overlooked. No? And traditionally maybe was not as exciting as launchers or else. Was considered critical. As simple as that.
So what stands out to you in how Europe is approaching resilience? Not the headline moves, but, the subtler ones that maybe signal direction.
I would say at least in a couple of dimensions. The first one is supporting very much national demand, or at least European-made solutions. And I think we've seen this with Starlink. There have been a lot of rumors of, for example, Italy and Germany buying long-term agreements with Starlink. Now Germany has decided that they will build their own Satcom constellation for the Bundeswehr with a significant chunk of the 35 billion euros that have been allocated for these upcoming 5 years, which is an unprecedented amount of money if we compare it to the overall typical ballpark that we talk about in Europe. No? We have ESA that typically has 3 years ministerial budgets of 22, 25 billion euros. Now we have 35 just for a single country and just for space defense for 5 years. And also it's really an order of magnitude game changer. And the second key element is, again, considering how to balance national initiatives with European-wide ones. And that's another key element that we need to sort it out in Europe to make sure that we are successful. We avoid redundancy because at the end of the day, we cannot afford them. Two, okay, we have more money. Even all combined, we're still investing in space less than what the US, for example, are doing. And on a PPP party, even one less than what China, for example, is doing. So we need to be mindful of avoiding redundancy and rather find the proper way to integrate those capabilities. If we're going to have 3 different SATCOM constellations, so be it. Let's do it so in a way that they talk to each other rather than fully replicate maybe coverage on areas, which can naturally happen. And for example, leave the polar area totally uncovered.
You go to conferences, they always have a speaker on supply chain. So how are questions around supply chain exposure influencing the way industry thinks about sovereignty right now?
It is certainly growing. In my view, it's still very much underappreciated, this complexity. Again, not only in space, but in the overall aerospace and defense industry as a whole. We only realize that once a crisis hits. That's the reality. When all of a sudden there is a shortage of titanium because Russia is not supplying anymore after the Ukrainian invasion, or similar choke points happen, then this is the moment when we take actions. This is unfortunately a bit short-sighted, no more, no less. And I think we really need to do much better to prevent those choke points and those issues. Still, as Europeans, first, we need to really learn to stand on our own legs because we have the industrial capabilities to do so. We need them to deploy the assets and to actually convert them into services, into solutions, into customers. Then we can probably go one step further and really solve the overall value chain issue. But it's going to really take time, and I would say a systemic effort, because also some of these materials are not necessarily only relevant for space, but for other segments, let's say automotive or chemicals or else. So we need really a 360 holistic approach to this.
Yeah, you say it's going to take time. Well, let's peer into the future. Let's get out of that crystal ball. It's going to take time. So as you look ahead, what forces do you think will have the biggest impact on reshaping what space sovereignty means for Europe over the next decade?
If we build on what we just said, I think unfortunately, on one end, crisis, because there's really discontinuity moments where all of a sudden there is this moment of realization where you need to do things very differently. And in my view, the second key enabler to that is how are we going to be able to actually encompass all together, on one end, the traditional industrial capabilities, and on the other, the innovation vibe that the new space industry is bringing to all of this ecosystem. If we can actually mix those up in an effective way, then we can really be successful and really unlock sovereignty across the entire value chain, across different domains, and be successful on this venture. Otherwise, I think it's going to be challenging on both legs to do on its own. The industry is traditionally, I don't want to say slow, but in reality, again, it has a number of processes of internal steps that requires a much faster approach in some occasions. Again, the crisis that we just mentioned.
Good.
The newcomers are still not that mature. They cannot do it all by themselves because the money, the capital, the capabilities are not really there. So the combination can be a winning team.
Yeah. Alessio, I think you've given our listeners a pretty good handle on understanding space sovereignty here in 2026. I'd like to thank our guest, Alessio Bonucci, Associate Director for the Aerospace and Defense Practice at Boston Consulting Group. Thank you.
Thank you, John.